Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, the war of words continues between President Trump and President Putin over the conflict in Ukraine. The US president is calling his Russian counterpart crazy. This follows on from a weekend which saw one of the largest Russian missile and drone attacks to hit Ukraine in more than 2 years. Well, today, the Kremlin's been hitting back, saying that President Trump is showing signs of emotional overload. Well, on today's program, we'll be speaking to two men who advised both President Putin and President Trump. Plus, we'll be getting the latest from a former senior US military leader. And another story we're following for you today, as accusations continue to fly about who knew what about President Joe Biden's health, we speak to a former White House physician to get his thoughts. Hello and welcome to the program. Lots to talk about today in relation to the exchange of comments between President Donald Trump and the Kremlin, and also with regards to the overall situation on the battlefield in Ukraine itself. Well, let's get started by crossing to Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who is the former commander of US Army forces in Europe. He joins us from Frankfurt. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Let's start by looking at these comments that have been coming out of the Kremlin and also coming from President Trump. The latest in the exchange is Russia is saying that everyone is feeling, quote, emotional at the moment. It sounds as though they're aiming that at President Trump. Does he sound like he's being emotional to you?
No, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that the president is clueless about how to solve this. When he said he was surprised that Putin has gone crazy, I mean, where has he been over all these years? Putin is the one that's been consistently evil. President Trump has been outmaneuvered by Vladimir Putin, unfortunately. And now we're seeing, and the Europeans are seeing, that the United States is probably not going to play a significant role in helping Ukraine or getting this conflict to any kind of good, positive resolution.
Do you think President Trump's characterization of President Putin as being, quote, unquote, crazy, do you think that's likely to shift perception of the Russian president amongst President Trump's base? Because many of them have sounded sympathetic to the Kremlin in the past.
Well, that's a fair question, and it has puzzled me for the last few years why Republicans, the so-called MAGA base of the Republican Party, how in the world they have ever been sympathetic towards Russia and Vladimir Putin. Given the long history of the Republican Party, this is unbelievable that now you've got Republicans, so-called conservatives, that are actually supporting Russia instead of a democratic country, Ukraine, that's fighting for its existence. So perhaps the president, who has consistently sought to avoid being responsible for anything that goes bad, is perhaps trying to change the narrative about, you know, this is all Putin's fault, he's unreasonable, et cetera. But I have, unfortunately, and I know I'm being pretty harsh here, but I have zero confidence that the Trump administration is going to do anything to help Ukraine unless Republican members of the Congress finally stand up and say enough is enough, because they are also enabling Trump's bad behavior. They're going to end up owning this failure if it really goes bad. And so hopefully some Republicans in the Congress will put pressure on the president to do something. But if he doesn't, the risk only goes up for Europe. And this is why I think we're seeing some European leaders taking more decisive stands, such as what the German Bundeskanzler, Mr. Merz, is doing this week.
But to be fair on Mr. Trump, I mean, 126 days into his administration, he has got both the Russians and the Ukrainians talking. They've had face-to-face talks. Washington and Moscow have had some exchanges. I mean, it could be argued that he's done more in 126 days than the previous administration did towards advancing the goal of peace.
No, not at all. He's done nothing to advance the goal of peace. He has been played by the Russians from the start, and his special envoy, Mr. Witkoff, is way out of his depth. The administration has taken the Russian side from the very beginning. They gave away all of their leverage early on by saying that Ukraine would have to give up land before applying any leverage against the Russians. So I would say he has done zero to advance the cause. He has given the Russians everything they wanted, or has failed to do anything to put pressure on the Russians, and that's why Lavrov mocked the American president, talking about, oh my gosh, he must be under a lot of emotional pressure. I don't think this was a sincere statement from Mr. Lavrov.
Has President Trump obtained any concessions from the Russians? You mentioned that some concessions were made to the Russians early on. Have any been made by the Russians in your view?
Zero, nothing.
And why do you think that is?
Yeah, because he hadn't asked for it. He hadn't put any pressure on them. The Russians, this is like clubbing baby seals. I mean, they've had to do nothing, and they mock the United States. They show disrespect for the European leaders, and they still have not changed any of their objectives. They don't back. I mean, they refuse to acknowledge that President Zelenskyy is the legitimate president of Ukraine. So no, they haven't changed or backed away from anything. I think what happened during this famous 2-hour phone call, where Trump talked a lot of smack going into it, Putin probably told him that there probably would be some good business deal for America at the end of it. And so he comes out, and then there's zero pressure on Russia. So I think not only is this bad for American credibility, it's also delayed, I think, some European leaders from acting more decisively, because they kept thinking that surely the American president would follow through on his threats. And so they've hesitated. I think they can all see clearly now that's never going to happen. And so European leaders are going to have to act more firmly on their own.
What does that mean, acting more firmly on their own? What do you envisage European leaders doing, therefore?
Well, first of all, to follow through on what they said 2 weeks ago, that if Russia refused to enter a ceasefire with Ukraine, that Europe would impose severe restrictions. I'm sorry, sanctions. So that's something that's out there. They have not done yet. The announcement today by the German Bundeskanzler that weapons from Germany, UK, and France and the United States could be used without restriction, that's a big deal. That's a change in policy that won't win the war, but it certainly will give Ukraine the ability to strike these airfields from which these bombers are taking off and killing innocent Ukrainian civilians. That's an important step. And then I think the economic tools have not been fully utilized. And so if you get all the countries of Europe plus Canada working together, they could do a lot of damage to Russia's oil and gas infrastructure by stopping these illegal shadow fleet vessels that are taking oil and gas out through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. They could work with other oil-producing nations to manipulate market prices so that it goes down to a level that would damage Russia's ability to continue the war. So there's a lot that Europe can do with or without American support.
So, General Hodges, when you look at the situation we're in right now, which has got President Trump sort of being pretty harsh in his choice of words with regards to the Russian president, do you think we're basically in a situation where after 126 days in office, he's coming around to the European way of approaching this conflict?
Well, that has been my hope all along, is that he would finally get tired of Putin playing him, making him look foolish and mocking him, and that he would say, okay, I'm going to use all this leverage I have now. But so far, he has not done that. After you keep mentioning 126 days, he's done zip all. So let's see. If he does, I'll be the first to admit that I was wrong. But so far, until I see real economic pressure by the United States government on the Russians and the delivery of air and missile defense capabilities, when I see those things, then I will believe that Mr. Trump has indeed come around. But right now, I see zero evidence of that.
We've got a situation at the moment, which is where Russia is talking about peace, accusing Ukraine of trying to derail President Trump's peace efforts. And on the other hand, they are bombarding Ukraine in an unprecedented manner. They have been these last few days. I mean, what do we read into that? Well,
what I read into it is that Russia has no intention of stopping. that they have demonstrated their commitment to continuing their mission to destroy Ukraine and to destroy the idea of Ukraine as a state. So constantly attacking civilian infrastructure, killing civilians, is it's clear that they have no intention of seeking out a peaceful resolution to this conflict. They continue to go out and find bodies for their poorly trained army, which they use in these assaults that are costing them over 1,000 casualties a day. But for the Russians, casualties are not the thing. The Russians will keep doing what they're doing until they believe that they can't win. And they won't believe that until they see serious economic pressure, I mean, real economic pressure that damages them, and a commitment by Europe and the United States to deliver everything that Ukraine needs without restriction. When they see that, then they'll know that they cannot win. But until then, they're going to keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah, they're not going to just continue doing what they're doing. They're going to take it even further. They say they're going to push even harder into Sumy and Kharkiv. I mean, do you think we're looking at a summer of a major uptick in violence in this war?
Well, it's obvious that they cannot defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. I mean, Ukraine cannot push them out, but the Russians cannot defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. They can only continue to try and attrit Ukrainian forces, kill innocent people, but they don't have the capability to actually defeat Ukraine. And their economy is in trouble. I mean, I don't think their economy can sustain years and years of what it's doing right now, especially if the West were to actively go after their oil and gas industry.
And does it look to you, from where you sit, like Ukraine is getting a similar level of military support that it was getting in the past? In the past, there were grand announcements about arms being sent to Ukraine. Now we understand they're being sent, but there is no such grand announcement. Is your understanding that the necessary weaponry is getting through?
I think what matters is what's getting through, not the announcements. And
right.
Germany has adopted a policy of not advertising what they're providing, which I think actually makes sense. So I don't have a feel for how much is still being delivered, but what was approved under the Biden administration, that's still in the pipeline. The Trump administration has not given approval for additional, at least nothing of substance that I can see. But other countries are, in fact, continuing to deliver ammunition, weapons. I just saw another announcement by the French about howitzers. So I think there is still there are still support going in. I don't have a feel for how much and what all it consists of.
From what you do know, though, and what you see in the media and what you read in the press, does it appear that Ukraine is managing to hold its own on the battlefield, or are any major advances being made by the Russians?
No, Russia has not made a major advance in 2 years. I mean, they're creeping where they have any progress. And, General Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander, gave his testimony in front of the U.S. Congress, House and Senate Armed Services Committee about a month ago, and he said, in his assessment, Ukraine is winning on the battlefield. The Russian Navy, nowhere to be seen. The Russian Air Force has failed to achieve air superiority. So really all the Russians can do is continue to kill innocent people with these raids on cities and continue to try and attrit. But they're not making major progress anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know the exact death toll, but we're told at least 100,000 killed on each side. We talked a little bit about the financial cost and how this has affected the Russian economy with sanctions, and indeed the fact that the economy is in a war economy mode. Do you see this taking a political toll in Russia? Because it hasn't done so far, has it?
Well, first of all, I don't know where you got your numbers from. British intelligence says Russia has suffered over 900,000 killed and wounded. So that's a significant number, but that really doesn't matter that much in Russia, at least not yet. It's hard to say on the political toll on Putin. I think when the oligarchs around him, the people that keep him in power, when they start suffering, that could change things. But for right now, Putin seems to have made himself coup-proof.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of the U.S. Armed Forces in Europe. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for the privilege.
We can cross now to central Moscow and speak to Sergei Markov, who is a former spokesperson to President Putin. Mr. Markov, great to have you with us. Looks like you're in a traffic jam there in central Moscow, driving around. Just to make it clear to our viewers, you aren't the driver of the car, because that wouldn't be a responsible thing to be doing. But let's get started by talking about the dialogue, the exchange between Moscow and Washington these last few days. Most recently, the Kremlin accusing Washington, perhaps specifically President Trump, of, quote, emotional overload. I mean, this is quite unusual language, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very unusual language. And at the same time, it looks like that Vladimir Putin not offended, but a reaction of press secretary of Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Peskov, was very, very mild. He told that, oh, I understand that it's emotional words because people could be in an emotional situation in such situation. We're very glad that United States help us to promote peace negotiation with Ukraine. So it was absolutely not no sharp, strong response from the Moscow. Public opinion here in Moscow quite offended by such words of Donald Trump, but not Kremlin, not Vladimir Putin. And also, I personally believe that this rude word of Donald Trump against Vladimir Putin will not lead to the bad actions of Donald Trump against Russia. But on contrary, I personally believe, I personally guess that Donald Trump will use this bad word against Vladimir Putin as balance to the future bad actions against Ukrainian regime and Vladimir Zelenskyy.
What do you mean by that? Which bad actions carried out by who?
Its decision to stop any military supply. You know, now Ukrainian army getting such American weaponry, which was the decision of Joe Biden administration. I would say that Ukrainian army now fighted by Joe Biden weaponry. And now it's increasing pressure of the Donald Trump from some pro-war forces inside United States and from pro-war European coalition to give weaponry to the Ukrainian army. And I think that Donald Trump very close to decision that United States will not give any American weaponry to Ukrainian army, and Ukrainian army will be in quite more difficult situation during this summer.
You say that, but at the same time, President Trump has been saying, quote, I've always said President Putin wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it. That's one topic to discuss. And he said, but if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia. How does Russia interpret that? i.e., if you try to take all of Ukraine, this will lead to the downfall, the collapse of Russia. How would you interpret that?
I think that Donald Trump want to say to the Vladimir Putin and to the general public that the task to take control of the whole Ukraine could be too tough for Russia, and maybe even Russian resources will be not enough to resolve this problem. And Donald Trump partly right, because Vladimir Putin told that Russia is going to continue this war until main Russian demands will be accepted by Western coalition. Main demand is, first of all, to stop anti-Russia, to stop doing anti-Russia on the territory of Ukraine by terroristic methods. It's very simple Russian demands. It means that should be demilitarization of Ukraine as limitation of Ukrainian army and amount of weaponry, denazification as stopping of the system of political terror in Ukraine, and also stopping any prohibition of Russian language, Russian culture, and Orthodox Church. So the Russian strategy is very simple. We will continue our military operation until the moment when these demands will be accepted. If not accepted, Russia is ready to continue.
Yeah, you say it's very simple, but on the one hand, President Trump is trying to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia. And at the same time, Russia is stepping up its aerial bombardment of Ukraine, including during the last 24 hours. I mean, what's Russia trying to achieve here?
Please don't follow anti-Russia route propaganda. Now Russia really attacked Ukrainian city, but it was a very clear response to the tremendous attacking of Ukrainian army against central Russia and against Moscow, first of all. Something about 70% of the Ukrainian drones attacked not front line and kilometers, zone around front line, but they attacked exactly Moscow and cities around this. And Russia promised to give response and was giving a response. Western anti-Russia lie propaganda saying only about Russian attack and saying nothing about the Ukrainian attack is because they want to influence Donald Trump. They want Donald Trump to be angry against Vladimir Putin and to join again a so-called war coalition against Russia. So it means that Russia attacked these Ukrainian cities now in very big amount, first of all, as a response to the increasing of the Ukrainian attack against Moscow.
Well, to be fair, I mean, didn't Russia invade Ukraine to begin with? It wasn't Ukraine that invaded Russia to begin with.
Oh, no. It's also a very big falsification of the anti-Russian propaganda. Russia sent a troop for humanitarian goal to save people from Donbass who was striving because 8 years of the war of Ukrainian army against Donbass who claim on independence. I personally took part many time conferences in Donetsk, the capital of Donbass, and I was wake up every night because of sharing of Ukrainian artillery. It was a clear terroristic sharing of the peaceful cities during 8 years. And to stop this terroristic pressure, Vladimir Putin sent Russian troops.
Okay, but they tried to advance on Kiev, and they didn't succeed in capturing Kiev quite as quickly as they thought they were going to. I mean, are you sure you stand by that?
Vladimir Putin sent Russian troops to Kiev and another Ukrainian city to change this government, to stop ruling of the terroristic government.
Let's go back to talking about the row, the war of words between the Kremlin and Washington. How does the Russian public feel about all of this? And how much debate is there in Russia about how to bring this war to an end?
You mean the war is not exist. It was no any root wars from the Kremlin. Kremlin, on contrary, gave very polite and moderate response to such a route Donald Trump was. And in Russian public reacted, first of all, quite emotionally. And they told, oh, look, Donald Trump doesn't want peace. He wants to continue the war. it's some kind of almost opening the new stage of war. But because most of the Russian society, Russian public, very loyal to Vladimir Putin. And when this public sees that no government they control media, criticize Donald Trump for this, and no Russian officials criticize Donald Trump for this, Russian public also became more calm. And some of Russian public believes that probably it was even some kind of secret agreement between Putin and Trump behind of this. And maybe exactly Trump told this route was to balance future very bad actions for the Ukrainian regime.
So you're basically saying that by calling President Putin crazy, which is what President Trump did in a tweet. I'll just read out what he said. He said, "I always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy." So you're saying that President Trump saying that means he's about to do something completely different, which is going to be massively to the disadvantage of Ukraine. That's how you interpret this.
Yeah. We know that sometimes Donald Trump not doing what he's talking. And from our point of view, Donald Trump interesting to stop any to giving no any to give all any American weaponry and American money to the Ukrainian regime. And I think that Donald Trump is looking for some pretext, some reasons to stop spending of American money to Ukrainian regime. First of all, Donald Trump wants to have some peace deal, but peace deal now impossible because Ukrainian regime fully deny any reasonable demands from Russian side. First of all, about denazification and demilitarization and stopping political repression. And because of this, Donald Trump has to find something new, not peace deal, because peace deal now impossible. And Vladimir, maybe Donald Trump is waiting some kind of help from Vladimir Putin to make this decision to stop giving weaponry to Ukrainian army. It's main.
There's been a report in the British media, someone who claims to have seen this for themselves firsthand, that President Trump is afraid of President Putin. What do you make of that? Do you think there's any truth to it?
I'm sure that Donald Trump don't afraid Vladimir Putin because also Vladimir Putin don't threaten to Donald Trump, and United States bigger than Russia with by economy and by political influence and so on. I think it's another case. First of all, Donald Trump like Vladimir Putin, I think. Because they share same political values, first of all, Christian political values, and you may know that Vladimir Putin protecting Christianity, first of all, Orthodox Church. Also, they share traditional values like they doesn't like LGBT propaganda, and they support some family values. Of course, surprisingly, because personal behavior, both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump may be not ideal for the family values, but by their political programs, they for sure support family values. And also, very important, Donald Trump wants peace. And Donald Trump understands very well that Vladimir Putin wants peace in Ukraine, and Vladimir Zelenskyy, as European leaders or Britain, France, they want war. That's why Donald Trump, I think, like Putin.
Okay, so just to wrap up our conversation, President Trump has called President Putin crazy. The Kremlin is saying this has been emotional overload on the other side. But you're saying perhaps not a massive rift, just an exchange of some opinions here. I mean, are you basically saying this is nothing serious?
I think that Donald Trump told rude words against Vladimir Putin, not because he want to have bad, not because he preparing to make bad actions against Vladimir Putin, against Russia, but because Donald Trump has to react on the massive media information about Russian attacks against Ukrainian cities, and no information, censorship about information about Ukrainian attack against Moscow. And also Donald Trump ready to make negative decision for Ukrainian regime and making bad words against Putin as a balance to the future negative actions against Ukrainian regime.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We're going to have to leave it there. Sergei Markov, former spokesperson to President Putin. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Now I'm following exactly FSB.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you very much.
Main build.
Well, William Taylor is the former US ambassador to Ukraine and joins us now. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ambassador Taylor. Great to speak to you once again. I don't know what you make of the exchange of comments, shall we say, between the Kremlin and the White House these last few days. Russia seems to have had the last word, saying that everyone is feeling emotional at the moment. Are they getting at President Trump, and do you think he's showing signs of being emotional?
I think President Trump is again showing signs of frustration with the Russians. It's not the first time. He has expressed himself about how Putin might be tapping him along, or he's pissed off, was frustrated with the Russians at not accepting his proposals. So this is the latest time that President Trump has expressed this irritation. The real question, Tom, is whether or not this time it's enough for President Trump to actually pull the trigger on some sanctions to indicate that it's more than just words, that he can take some actions to put pressure on Putin to come to the table.
Right, so from going from praising President Putin to calling him, quote, crazy, I mean, you're saying this isn't a sudden shift in rhetoric, it's sort of been a gradual build-up and the result of some pent-up frustration. Is that roughly what you're saying, Ambassador?
That's what I'm saying. It's and a buildup indicates that it's kind of linear. It continues to go up, but it's gone up and down. President Trump has expressed his frustration, and then he has a conversation with President Putin, and he starts talking about economic development. But then Putin again just hammers the Ukrainians with enormous attacks, record attacks on civilian targets and on infrastructure. And President Trump notices, and he gets irritated again. Again, the question for us, the question for this issue is, when does President Trump move from irritation, frustration, anger to actually taking some steps?
Is that what you'd like to see the president do?
Absolutely, absolutely. The only way this is going to stop, and which President Trump rightly wants to happen, the only way this is going to stop is if there's pressure on Putin. If Putin comes to the conclusion as a result of that pressure, he cannot win. He cannot win on the battlefield. He needs to negotiate. He needs to agree to a ceasefire. The only way that's going to happen is if there's pressure put on him, and that's what needs to happen.
But when we've got language like that being used, you know, President Trump calling President Putin crazy, the Kremlin saying we're talking about emotional overload, quote unquote. I mean, does it suggest that diplomacy is somehow having to give way to personality-driven, unpredictable policy?
Diplomacy is not going forward now. That's clear. And the reason it's not going forward now is also clear. It is Putin. President Trump and President Zelenskyy 2 months ago agreed on a 30-day comprehensive air, land, and sea ceasefire. President Trump took that to President Putin. President Putin said no. He has said no every time. Not only has said no, he has continued to bombard the Ukrainians. By the way, that's all he can do. He can just fire drones and missiles. Putin is making no progress on very little progress on the battlefield. a meter here, a town, a crossroads there. So he's not getting anywhere on the battlefield. The only thing he can do is use these missiles and drones. And so there's no diplomacy until there is pressure put on Putin.
You mentioned that agreement 2 months ago, and yet if we cast our mind back 3 months to that famous Oval Office incident when President Zelenskyy was more or less shooed out of the White House, I mean, it does look like President Zelenskyy is now back in the fold, and perhaps that suggests President Trump has had a broader rethink of how he's going to view this entire conflict, and really which side he's going to lend the more support to. I mean, is that how it looks to you?
I think that's right. And after that Oval Office disaster that you just talked about, there was in the Vatican at the funeral this one-on-one, this kind of face-to-face between President Trump and President Zelenskyy, where they clearly understood each other. And that was, I think, a turning point for this. Again, it has gone up and down from the United States, from the White House, from President Trump. But I do believe that now it is clearer and clearer that President Trump understands that Putin is the problem. Putin is not our friend. Putin is the one holding up this initiative. President Trump, again, has made it his priority to end this war, to end this killing, as he says every time. That's a commendable thing. The problem has been Putin, and I believe that President Trump now understands that Putin is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting interviewing people on this channel. Obviously, we've been covering the Ukraine war, well, in my case, for a number of years, since it began. And a few months ago, I mean, talking to people in the Trump administration, it sounded like a lot of their lines to take were very, very much in lockstep with the lines to take that the Kremlin might have given us on the same sort of issues. I don't know if you've seen, whether you noticed that as well, and whether or not you've subsequently seen a shift in that narrative in terms of how people in President Trump's orbit now view this conflict. Do you think there has been a significant shift?
I do think there has been a shift, and you're absolutely right. The early days of the Trump administration, where there were some inexplicable decisions, that is, you will remember, I'm sure you reported, that the United States voted with Russia and North Korea and Belarus in the United Nations. We voted against a resolution that would condemn Russian invasion. And we've supported that every year over and over. And all of a sudden, in January, we flipped, and we supported the Russians instead of the Ukrainians in the UN. That, I think, has changed. We are, as for the reasons that we've talked about, that is this understanding that President Trump and President Zelenskyy came to in the Vatican. The minerals deal that you referenced turns out now to be a pretty good deal on both sides. It didn't start off that way. There were lots of negotiations to make that better, and I think it is better. And that's an indication as well that the United States is aligned with Ukraine on economics and on the desire to get to a negotiated ceasefire. And again, Putin is not there, but there has been a shift in the direction of supporting the Ukrainians on their desire for a ceasefire.
Right, and by extension, therefore, the Trump administration perhaps coming more around to the European position on this conflict, which hasn't really changed in the last few months. I mean, do you think there are going to be some sighs of relief in the corridors of power in European capitals?
I think European capitals have stepped up, have really recognized that they need to take the lead on the support for Ukraine. That even though there is this shift or perceived shift in the U.S. policy in favor of Ukraine against Russia, recognizing that Russia is the problem, even though we see that the Europeans know that they're going to have to pick up the ball. They're going to have to pick up the burden. They're going to have to provide the weapons and the ammunition and maybe the funds so that the Ukrainians can buy weapons from the Americans. The Europeans are also stepping up their plans to provide a deterrent force if there is a ceasefire. There have been good discussions. They've dragged out a bit, but nonetheless, the discussions have never happened before on how the Europeans could get together and put a force on the ground in Ukraine to be sure that the Russians don't invade again in the event there's a ceasefire. All to say that, yes, the Europeans have stepped up out of concern that the Americans might not be there. Europeans have stepped up. And with that stepping up, with that European moving forward, I believe that the Trump administration can support that.
And Ambassador Taylor, I'm sure you'll recall as well, I mean, in the early days of the second Trump presidency, it sounded rather as though President Trump was making various concessions to Moscow on behalf of Ukraine and not getting too many in return. I mean, have you noted any concessions that have been made by Moscow during the course of these last 3 or 4 months?
None whatsoever. None whatsoever. They continue to demand essentially the Ukrainian surrender. That's what they're asking for every time. The root causes they talk about, Putin talks about. That's code for, very barely code for Ukrainian surrender. That is limits on their ability to defend themselves, no going into NATO, no support from the West in terms of military support. So yes, there have been no indications that the Russians are willing to make any compromises, no concessions whatsoever.
Yeah, and it's just interesting trying to reconcile that and trying to reconcile those early concessions made by the Trump administration with one of the latest pieces put out on social media by President Trump. He says, quote, "I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it, and maybe that's proving to be right. But if he does," warns President Trump, "it will lead to the downfall of Russia." Let's unpack that. Let's start by talking about what does the downfall of Russia mean in this particular context, you think?
So if Putin tries to take all of Ukraine, which again, I believe is his ultimate goal, he wants to dominate Ukraine, eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign nation. And if he, as President Trump suggests, if Putin tries to take over Ukraine, occupy all of Ukraine, that's an impossible task. He will fail. Putin will fail. He cannot dominate Ukraine. The Ukrainians will resist. They will continue to fight. And in the end, Russia will fail. When they fail, when Russia fails in its history, leaders who are responsible for those failures don't last. That may be what President Trump's talking about.
Okay, we're coming to the end, but I just want to ask you, I mean, on the one hand, we've got a situation where Russia is sort of talking about negotiations and peace efforts, and there have been direct contacts between Kiev and Moscow. And on the other hand, they're stepping up the bombing campaign on Kiev, as they have done in the last couple of days. What should be the American response from a diplomatic point of view to this apparent duplicity on the part of the Russians?
It is duplicitous. You're exactly right. Yes, on the one hand, the Ukrainians and the Russians can deal where there is will to come to an agreement, like on the prisoner exchange, 1,000 prisoners in each direction last weekend. Because the Russians wanted it, the Ukrainians wanted it, it can be done. But when you look at the ceasefire discussions, the ceasefire negotiations, the Ukrainians want it, the Americans want it, the Europeans want it, and the Russians don't. So if the Russians don't want to deal, don't want to negotiate, don't want to make any compromises, don't want to come to the table seriously to talk about a ceasefire, then there's not going to be one. So on the one hand, they've shown through these prisoner of war exchanges that it can be done. The conversation can take place. Agreements can be achieved. But when they don't want, when the Russians do not want the ceasefire, do not want negotiations, it cannot be done.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. William Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Alexander Khara, who is the fellow at the Center of Defense Strategies and a former advisor to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense. He joins us from Kiev. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again here on Al Arabiya English. quite a big change, it would appear, in the White House's position towards this conflict since that famous 28th of February showdown in the Oval Office. How does it feel to hear President Trump describing President Putin as absolutely crazy and threatening new sanctions against Russia?
Hello, Tom. It's good to be on your program. I don't think that something significant has changed since Mr. Trump got into the White House. If I talk about the craziness of Mr. Putin, I believe it didn't begin just a couple of days ago on Friday when the Russians started to bombard the whole of Ukraine, and particularly the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, with almost 1,000 drones and missiles over the weekend. I believe that Putin got crazy back in 2000 when he blew up some apartments in Russia to get to the power in Russia, and then the brutal Chechen war. And then there were many other conflicts within Russia, particularly in the Northern Caucasian republics, and in Ukraine and in Georgia in 2008, and in Syria, tens of thousands of people been killed by Putin, and because he's playing geopolitical role. Not to mention killing of Mr. Litvinenko in the United Kingdom, or attempt to poison Skripals with the chemical agent. So the track record of Mr. Putin is pretty robust since 2000, and I don't think that Mr. Trump didn't know about that. But why it was so triggering for Mr. Trump and that he went to criticize Putin, that he is not happy that his charisma is not working as he is supposed to have the results of this conversation with Putin. Putin de facto rejected each and every proposal of Mr. Trump. To start with this partial and comprehensive and lasting ceasefire. Putin rejected that, and we didn't have it for a single day. And he violated all other agreements that he reached either with Ukraine or with the United States. So I believe it's just a way how to show his impatience and his readiness to do symbolic gestures to pressure Russia, but not to the level that may stop Putin from carrying on his aggressive war against Ukraine.
All right, so you're saying this is some sort of a negotiating tactic by President Trump, and if so, what does it achieve?
As Ambassador Bolton, once the national security advisor to the President Trump, he said that Trump doesn't have neither grand strategy nor small strategy. So he is just feeling this way. He is driven by some advice from his inner circle, who are not really competent people, like Steve Witkoff, who is actually special representative for the Middle East, but it happened to be that he is in charge of the talks between Americans and Russians. And given the ideas that Mr. Witkoff brought from the Kremlin, it's clear he has zero clue about the Russian history, Ukrainian history, and the depth of this conflict. So that's why what we can judge is the just, I would say, erratic messaging and erratic actions of Mr. Trump. Even though he has a genuine, let's say, noble belief and noble desire to bring this war to an end. But he is not relying on the professionals. And actually, the recent news that the National Security Council laid out just more than 100 employees. It means that the capacity and ability of the president to maneuver on the geopolitical scene is going to be even more limited with less manpower that he has. But he is not relying on the advice, let's say, of General Kellogg, who is involved in talks in Ukraine and between Ukrainian side and American side, or Mr. Rubio, who is pretty aware of Russia and what kind of threat it poses to the United States, to the European partners, and certainly to Ukraine. And not to mention other people who may have advised Trump properly on this complex issue.
But does it feel, sitting from where you are in Ukraine, like what President Trump has said in the last 24, 48 hours is a little bit of a morale boost? Because it does sound like he's a bit more on Ukraine's side on all of this than he was, let's say, at the end of February.
Well, you're right. We want to keep Americans in diplomatic process. We would like to have open options for the assistance, security assistance, and ability for Ukraine and our partners to procure defense material for Ukraine. But from the other hand, we don't have any illusions that Trump has changed his mind and now he's going to impose more cost on Russia and boost his support for Ukraine. No, not at all. So he may say some harsh words towards Putin, but I don't think that he will impose devastating sanctions against Russia. It will be just the same policies as the previous administration and the European partners, that they are imposing sanctions with the aim to, let's say, alter the course of Mr. Putin. If Trump wanted to stop this war really, he would have imposed devastating sanctions that Russia is not able to carry on this war because of economic troubles. I understand it's difficult to achieve because Russia is bailed out by, first and foremost, China, but India and some other countries, and it's difficult to reach out to Chinese. They are not ready to abandon their junior partner, Russia. But certainly there are some tools how to, let's say, strike into the heart of the Russian world economy, and particularly export of energy commodities. And the other thing that he may have done is just increased assistance to Ukraine, because contrary to the common knowledge of many politicians and journalists, and I do not agree with them, there is no diplomatic solution to this conflict. People are saying vice versa. There is only a diplomatic solution, and there will be no possibility to stop this war by military means. Vice versa. It's a genocidal war. The Russians have resources, they have will, and they want to achieve this goal either this time on the second stage of the war, because the war started on February 2014 with illegal annexation of Crimea and then proxy war on Donbass.
Sure.
And in 2022 there was a second stage of the war.
Okay.
So we can stop this war only by defeating Russia and making it unable to proceed this conflict anymore.
So you're basically saying that the diplomatic efforts being made by the Trump administration aren't going to work, because not only are the Russians not showing any signs of wanting to go down the diplomatic road either. Let's look at the what happened in the last 3-4 days in terms of the uptick in aerial bombardment of Ukrainian territory as an example. And you're saying that Ukraine doesn't seem to think there's a diplomatic solution either. I mean, the diplomatic efforts look completely doomed, therefore, don't they?
First and foremost, for any diplomacy to have any success, you need to have at least a couple of sides that they think that a new status quo, political status quo, would be beneficial for both sides, and it's better to agree on something. And there should be some points to compromise on. The Russians are demanding not just illegally annexed territories of Ukraine, some that they control, and some they just put into their constitution, and they are not able to conquer anytime soon. But they want to limit our sovereignty. I'm talking about the decision to join alliances and unions or whatever, and they want to have a leverage of our domestic policy, justifying this invasion with this protection of so-called ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, or Orthodox Church. Which is certainly just a justification and not a real reason for this war. So, and in our case, we have not been defeated. We have resources, we have will, and we are going to defend our sovereignty, our national identity. And that's why we cannot compromise on all those things that the Russians badly need, or they actually want. And nobody is in power, including Mr. Trump, to impose such a compromise, I would rather say defeat on Ukraine. So that's why there is no space for compromise and diplomacy. But from the Russian point of view, they have will and resources. They believe that until this fall, they will be able to achieve some tactical goals on the battlefield. And we've seen some activities in the Eastern Front. They are trying to reach to Konstantinovka, which is a transportation hub, really important to keep our defenses in the east. They're trying to launch new attacks in Sumy region and Kharkiv region, and certainly they are trying to undermine Ukraine's will to resist by bombing civilian objects in Kiev and in many other cities. So they will use this military tool, and that's why they're not going to agree on any type of a ceasefire, because they understand that only exerting pressure over Ukraine and our partners, they can achieve these strategic political goals over Ukraine.
Right.
So I don't see that either side is ready to compromise anything. And in case of Ukraine, we are compromising something. And in case of Russia, they may compromise their neo-imperial ambitions, which is not the case. And actually, the last point, it's difficult to understand in the West, people who are rational, who count people's lives, and certainly for the Western societies, human life is the most precious thing that you can have. The Russians are thinking is the completely different way. Geopolitical greatness or the geopolitical status that Putin wants, and majority of Russians support this crazy idea. They are ready to sacrifice tens of thousands of their own subjects, not to mention Ukrainians, and they are ready to sacrifice tens of billions of dollars of economy. So they're thinking in completely different way, and that's why rational Western approaches towards Russia they just don't work.
Yeah, you make a lot of points there, and I just want to pick up on one in particular, which is, of course, I mean, it sounds unusual, but the weather is, isn't it, a really key factor in this war. And we're entering the period where there's the thaw, you know, the frozen conflict as it is for the cold winter months, where the conflict is partly frozen. We're coming up for that time of the year where there are going to be, we presume, some summer counteroffensives. I mean, do you foresee some significant developments during these warmer summer months on the battlefield?
Well, I hope there will be no success from the Russian side. They were not able to generate enough manpower to train them and so on, for obvious reason. Putin didn't want to call the general mobilization, because now those who are fighting against us is just like scum from jails and you know, the social outcasts. But the majority of those who are fighting against us, they came to kill us for money. And certainly because Russia is able to export a lot of energy to foreign markets, they have hard currency and they convert it into the material for the war, and they pay salaries for these soldiers. And if there was a general mobilization, it meant that the ordinary people who may support, well, theoretically support Putin, but they could have been pushed to fight to this war. And given the terrific pictures from the battlefield, you can find many in social media, it's just impossible to survive in this so-called kill zone at 30 kilometers depth between the sides because of the role of drones. I don't think that the Russians would be happily, you know, subscribing to army. So that's why Putin failed to mobilize many, let's say, men for this war, and he didn't have enough time to train them. Not to mention the equipment for these people. Russia is not capable of producing a huge amount of tanks and armored vehicles and other things. For the simple reason they were not prepared for this war. They thought that those stockpiles of Soviet weaponry can be modernized and used. So that's why I don't think that we will achieve any significant progress on the battlefield.
What about Ukraine's supplies? Because throughout this war, especially in the Biden administration, and not so much under the Trump administration, we've heard from Kiev calls for fresh supplies of arms, that they're running critically low. We haven't heard that so much lately. what is the state of Ukraine's military hardware supplies, and how do you assess Ukraine's air defense capacity at the moment?
Well, while in the beginning of the war in 2022, our partners were announcing their security packages, and it was a way of public diplomacy, how to influence Putin's will. And our partners were showing that they're going to be with us as long as it takes, and they can provide new capabilities. Now there is no reason to do that, and it's better to keep it in secrecy. And for example, the Germans decided not to announce what they are providing us with, and there are major supplies of weapons, equipment, and munition to Ukraine. So you will not find new announcements except of money, the budgetary assistance of some states. And what I would like to say that, the reason why we are in dire straits now, and we call it the war of attrition, we are here just because the Biden administration decided to not to provoke Russian nuclear response, and not to trigger Russia collapse. And that's why the Biden administration provided just necessary and just limited amount of weaponry and weapon system for the counteroffensive in 2023. And by doing that, they just like pushed Ukraine to fight in trenches, this first war type of warfare. If they were in better position, I mean, in better thinking, in thinking strategically about this conflict, they could have provided us with air power and missiles that could have enabled Ukrainian armed forces to fight maneuverable warfare. Because it's clearly, if there was a conflict between Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States, it could have completely different characters that we have in Ukraine. And the reason not just the Ukrainians are not capable of doing this because they were not trained for that. It's because we didn't have these capabilities in the first place. So we have some let's say, good news. Recently, Denmark has provided us with some F-16s that we need for our, first and foremost, for our air defense. But unfortunately, we don't have enough air power to change the tide of this war, to inflict huge damage on Russian battlefield. Now we are using F-16s mostly for shutting down incoming missiles from Russia. If we're talking about missile defense, it's difficult to compete with Russia. If in the beginning of the cooperation between Iran and Russia, Russians were sending, let's say, a couple of dozens of Shahed drones daily. So let's say just on last Saturday, they sent 250 Shahed drones, and they are capable of scaling up this number. And it's difficult to shut them down all, and particularly in Kiev. Kiev is a huge city. And certainly we employ machine guns, not just these SMT and other type of air defense systems. And if you're talking about the missiles, the Russians are modernizing their Iskander missiles. A recent one, they're just maneuvering, they're copying let's say, the trajectory of ballistic missiles, and it's difficult to intercept them even with the American Patriot interceptors.
Okay, just to, sorry to cut you short, we're nearly out of time. Just briefly, just tell us therefore, let me turn the question around. What does Ukraine need if it wants to achieve the goals that you've set out, which is namely not to win this conflict through diplomacy, but to win it militarily? What does Ukraine need right now?
Well, I think the clear thing is that change of mind in the West, and change of strategy, and actually a new strategy, or the only strategies that people can think about it. That our partners should understand that Ukraine should win this war, not that Russia is not winning and Ukraine is not losing. This formula doesn't work. Putin is not going to stop on the occupied territories. He wants to control the whole of Ukraine, and then proceed further to actually test the will of the NATO countries. And certainly Russia is not going to stop its malign activities elsewhere else, on the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and certainly on the European continent with sabotage and other things. So they should be understanding that there is no possibility to, let's say, pacify Putin and to agree on something. He's not going to honor any agreements with Ukraine or with Europe. And the only way how we can stop him is that first, Ukrainian defense forces are not withdrawing from their positions, and Russians have no illusions that they can conquer Ukraine. It means that, let's say, investment and assistance to Ukraine to have powerful defense forces.
Okay.
And the other thing is about sanctions, that Russia is running out resources to execute its war. And we haven't seen such a change of mind in the West. They are helping us, and we appreciate it. Certainly, without American and European support, we could have lost this war already. But fortunately, Europeans understand that this war is not about territory of Ukraine. It's about the whole European security architecture and the rule of law in the world. So that's why I believe the change of mind, the only thing that should happen, and it will trigger strategies and the supply of weapons and investment in Ukrainian defense industry and so on and so forth.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Sorry, we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for your time, though, today, Alexander Khara.
Thank you, Tom.
Very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we can speak now to Dr. Jeff Kuhlman, who was the White House physician under 3 US presidents, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Dr. Kuhlman. Let's start by talking about the news of President Biden and the news specifically that his prostate cancer has already spread to the bones. I was just wondering, what was your initial reaction when you heard that news?
Well, of course, empathy and support as a fellow person that I had known. Also, it is not common to present as metastatic prostate cancer, but it does happen to a small percent of individuals.
Yeah, and were you not also surprised by the fact that we're talking here about a man who had what could be argued to be the best medical attention in the world, who's suddenly diagnosed with this aggressive metastatic prostate cancer? I mean, what conclusions can we draw?
Well, 2 conclusions. One is advanced age is the #1 risk factor for cancer. He is 82 and a half, which is very old in human condition. And then also, often those that you think have the best care sometimes don't. And the third thing is prostate cancer screening is wrought with lots of inconsistencies, and there's lots of gaps in it. It does tend to work well till about age 70, but then after that, it's troublesome.
So, I mean, do you think it's too simplistic to say it's surprising, or someone perhaps wasn't doing what they should have done for this to have gone by undetected and not to have been caught sooner?
Yeah, as a physician, I can't say that. His physician followed the evidence-based guidelines from the expert groups, which in the US screen for prostate cancer with PSA blood test until age 70, which President Biden hit in 2012. They did do it another couple years, 71 and 72. The guidance is after the age of 70, they actually recommend against mass screening, but they say it should be that individual conversation between the doctor and the patient, whether, what are the risks and the benefits. There's going to be lots of false positives. There's going to be lots of biopsies that get done. So I assume that Dr. O'Connor and President Biden had that conversation from 2014 till 2025 and chose not to do it.
Yeah, indeed. The last known PSA that was done by President Biden was was indeed back in 2014. The presidents that you worked under, at least two of them, President George W. Bush and President Obama, did release their PSA tests, and obviously they did the tests for the results to have been released. President Biden, no. But would you have recommended, had you been the White House physician under President Biden, would you have recommended he do the PSA test anyway?
I would have had a conversation with him and say the risks are that we're going to find some false positives. Most 78 to 82-year-old men that are still in the workforce, we do get a PSA, and we just be prepared to, do some biopsy or some advanced imaging, and that's part of. That's part of when you're still in the workforce at that late in your life.
Okay, so you're saying that President Biden almost certainly was not given a PSA test, and therefore it doesn't look to you like there's been a result and then a subsequent cover-up. Would you dismiss that theory straight away?
I am not one to believe in cover-up. I only go with the information that's been released. Dr. O'Connor is a person of integrity, so he and President Biden say that the last one was 2014. I would like them to say what the number was, the numeric value, because there's lots of studies out there. If it's less than 2.5 or less than 3, then that puts us down one. Some of those say never test again in a 72-year-old. But if somebody turns up evidence that they did it and they were sitting on it, then that's completely different. And I don't agree with that. I think President Obama told me, I've learned never to lie to the American people. Eventually they'll find out the truth.
And Dr. Kuhlman, given that we're now in the month of May, President Biden left office only in January, so just over 4 months ago. I mean, does all of this suggest to you, and given the stage at which the former president's cancer is at, does that suggest to you that he was seriously ill during his final weeks and months in office? Well,
the timeline of the development of prostate cancer, how we know it, would be that the prostate cancer would be in his body for at least 5 years, which includes the time that he was in office. Many individuals have cancer in their body, and they can continue to function at a high level.
But of course, I mean, everyone knows it, and then it wasn't a great secret. President Biden bowed out of the race back in July 2024 to run for president again. There was a lot of speculation about his cognitive abilities at that stage. I mean, can we perhaps join the dots here and say that that cognitive decline was related to the fact that he was seriously ill? I mean, could cognitive decline be one of the symptoms?
So sometimes there's confounders. The number one factor for cognitive decline is advanced age. So the same day that Biden dropped out of the race, I had written a New York Times essay talking about both the 82-year-old candidate and the 78-year-old candidate should have neurocognitive assessment, hours of testing, not a 30-second screen. Prostate cancer as we know it, just in the prostate or in the bones, should not affect cognitive decline. Some of the treatments will affect cognitive ability. The cognitive decline that is age-related is memory, reasoning, speed of processing, spatial orientation. All of those, an 80-year-old man is not going to be what he was at 60 years old, and I think we saw those in decline.
But don't you think this is a likely explanation for the fact that, he was looking tired and was sometimes confused in the latter months of his presidency, and that cancer-related fatigue would be a very good explanation for it and could, in some cases, have been mistaken for simple age-related decline.
It certainly can contribute to fatigue. He doesn't have any brain-related symptoms that we know of, and we have not been told that he was on any treatment. Like sometimes if you do androgen blocking, then that can cause some cognitive decline. So I think his cognitive decline is age-related, and we have a 78-year-old president who I think should be closely watched and monitored and screened and tested for his cognitive ability also.
Tell us a little about the fit for duty screening process. What sort of tests are carried out typically? What sort of red flags might you be looking for as the president's physician?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So in the US Constitution, there is nothing that talks about the physical or mental requirements to be president. You basically just have to be 35 years old, and you have to have lived in the US for 14 years, and you have to be a natural born citizen, which I would point out our first 6 presidents weren't. I think they were born British subjects. So, but there's nothing that says the physical requirements. So we don't have a manual that we can look at. So what we try to do as the physician to the president is, most of us have military experience. What would be the physical standards to do the job?
And Dr. Kuhlman, obviously, the privacy of a patient is something that every doctor in the world takes extremely seriously. And yet, here, when we're talking about the President of the United States, we're not talking about any ordinary patient, are we? We're talking about perhaps the most scrutinized man or woman in the world, the most closely watched. It's quite conflicting, isn't it, presumably, as a White House physician, to know what can and cannot be discussed in the public domain. Did you find that a difficult balancing act?
Well, I tried to keep that in mind, their personal and medical privacy, but along with, common sense. Can they do the job? It's a 24/7 physically demanding job. And what do the American people, what should they know for that position? The health summaries, the physicals for President Clinton and President Bush and President Obama, I would present the information to them of what we're going to test, and then also what the results were and how we're going to report it. And none of them edited or said, "Oh, don't tell people that." There were always some minor things, like if somebody had traveler's diarrhea, or if they had, they didn't like some of the Latin names of the skin lesions, we'd put it in lay language. But as far as the substance of the report, they never ever said, don't tell the American people.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, obviously a lot of speculation about President Biden, as we said, right up until the end of his presidency, about his cognitive abilities. Of course, no one knew about his physical situation, at least in the detail we do now. How do we go about rebuilding trust? Because there's going to be a lot of people asking a lot of questions, and there already are, about whether or not there's been some sort of a cover-up. How would you recommend that the current White House physician goes about restoring some of that public trust?
Yeah, rebuilding trust once it's broken is challenging in many aspects of life. Healthcare is information and relationships, and it's built on trust. President Trump, who's been in office 4 months, he did select a physician that was not in his prior administration, which I think is a good thing. He picked Dr. Barbara Bella, who's a Navy emergency medicine physician. He's a man of good reputation, good integrity. The report that he came out It was factual. He did not put any hyperbole in it, and just stuck to the facts. So to me, you can't control the patient who's a politician who's going to use every opportunity to politicize just every issue under the sun. But the White House physician should stick to facts and should always avoid denial, delusion, and deceit.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Dr. Jeff Kuhlman, former White House physician, thank you very much for your time.
Good to talk to you.